In great dishonor and proud disrespect of Columbus Day, today's article focuses on the fugitive slaves that willingly broke the white man's slave laws, despite the potential consequences of their actions, and the escape routes they took to freedom. There were many destinations on the so-called Underground Railroad, or, one could say, that there were many underground railroads. Most of us that know anything about slavery in America know something of Queen Mother Harriet Tubman, who was a conductor of the Northern Underground Railroad. While you were aware of the Northern Underground Railroad, did you know that there was a Western Underground Railroad system? Did you know that there was a Southern Underground Railroad system? If you didn't know about these underground railroads, you probably didn't know that there was even an international underground railroad. The destinations of these underground railroad systems depended more on where the escaped slaves were coming from than where they were going. In other words, from what they were escaping was more important to the escaped slaves than to where they were escaping. First of all, one must be aware that slavery existed in the North more than 150 years. By the time slavery in the North was abolished, there were already well-established underground railroad systems everywhere slavery existed. In the early 17th century, slaves knew as much, if not more, about the layout of the land than did slave drivers. This was why, in the 18th century, indigenous people were being recruited by the white man to track those that were self-emancipated. The indigenous trackers may have failed to capture the so-called fugitives perhaps as often as they succeeded. To understand why these trackers didn't have a better success rate, it is recommended that one simply observe the American domestic so-called war on drugs. In Washington, D.C., for example, studies have proven that white youth tend to use more illegal drugs than so-called African Americans. Those same studies showed that the arrest rate of African American youth far exceeds that of European American youth. The arrest rate disparity is because, as studies prove, so-called African Americans are targeted for arrest. On the other hand, European American drug use is largely ignored, while on the surface the war was on drugs. Certain, quote, fugitives or lawbreakers of European descent were simply ignored when discovered by policing agencies. In the same way modern-day policing agencies, or trackers, sometimes ignore white criminals, indigenous trackers sometimes ignored fugitive slaves. They simply led their employers on a false trail which helped many fugitives remain free. Of course, the trackers had to track some fugitives successfully. This was so employers would continue to believe in their ability to track. This permitted the deception to continue. Before slavery was abolished in the North, fugitive slaves escaped to any territory that was absent of the white man. From the start, this meant escaping to so-called Indian Territory. Many of these Indian territories would remain a preferred fugitive slave destination until the end of the Civil War. In addition to escaping to the Indian Territories, some slaves escaped to Kansas, part of which, at one time was a safe haven for fugitive slaves in the West. Much like Pennsylvania eventually became a destination in the northern mid-Atlantic area in the East. Some slaves also escaped to uninhabited areas and built their own societies complete with houses, schools, farms, and fortifications. There is record of these free black states existing in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. There could very well have been more that went undiscovered or undocumented. Sometimes fugitive slaves that were captured chose death over revealing the location of these emancipated ties. Some of these communities functioned for generations and were destinations for runaway slaves. Of course, the international underground railroads included Canada. This is well known as it was part of the Northern Underground Railroad. Lesser-known slave destinations included the Bahama Islands and Mexico. It's important that we study history from our own perspective, perception, and interpretation of historical documents. We must also rely, to some degree, on our own common sense as well as our ability to think rather than simply regurgitate what those that don't have our best interest at heart have told us. This has been Daku Akabo wa Akatu.